I'm Stephanie Jansky, Director of Programming for the City Club of Cleveland. Welcome to the Happy Dog. We wanted to thank a couple of our partners who help put this event on every month, International Partners in Mission and Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and of course the Happy Dog who hosts us. We also, Professor Beinin is here courtesy of the local NACMES chapter and the College of Arts and Sciences at Kent State University and Case Western Reserve University. They brought Professor Beinin here today. If you like what you hear today, we encourage you to come back to the City Club and visit us for our other programming. On March 11th, we are bringing in Aaron David Miller, who is a Middle East scholar and analyst, and that's a noon program at the City Club. All of the information is on our website. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tony and Professor Beinin.
Well, thank you so much for coming. If you haven't been here before, really the point of this is to give you some insight into an international topic and then give you a chance to ask questions and hopefully get some clarifications too. I'm not an expert in Israeli-Palestinian issues here, so I'm going to do my best to ask questions that will provoke and hopefully get us some answers to inform us all. We'll talk for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor, because really I want to open it up to you and let you have a chance to respond. But the first thing we want to do, Professor Beinin, please tell us about yourself.
Okay, so my name is Joel Beinin. I have been teaching Middle East history at Stanford since 1983. In the recent past, I left Stanford for a couple of years and was director of Middle East Studies at the American University in Cairo. I studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I have lived in Israel for quite a long time. My family, all of them, have lived in Israel since 1973. My main areas of research and teaching are modern Egypt and Israel, Palestine, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Aaron David Miller went to University of Michigan, which I did, and his advisor was the same guy as my advisor. He was just a couple of years ahead of me.
There you go. If you've been listening to NPR today, as I hope you were, you would have heard that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, gave a speech today. I know, Professor, that you didn't follow the whole thing, but can you respond kind of generally to this call, first going to Congress and then saying that Iran is an existential threat to Israel?
So, as President Obama said, Prime Minister Netanyahu had nothing new to say today. He's been saying the same message for well over a year, basically trying to goad the United States into either attacking Iran or worse. And the basis for this is his personal evaluation against the advice of the heads of Israeli military and civilian intelligence, all of whom say that Iran is not in the process of building a nuclear weapon and hasn't been engaged in anything like that for quite a while. So he's basically turned this into a political football and asked to have his speech before the joint houses of Congress moved back. He was originally invited for February 17th. So today is 2 weeks before an Israeli election. March 17th is going to be a parliamentary election in Israel. So this is just an election stunt for him.
You don't think there's any legitimacy to taking the rhetoric from Iran about denying the Holocaust, talking about wiping out Israel? You don't think there's valid fear in that? Is it all politics?
Israelis are certainly afraid. That's a fact, and we shouldn't deny that. And Iranians have said a good number of truly horrible anti-Semitic things. In fact, the one who denied the Holocaust is the former president Ahmadinejad, who was basically a thug. And because he was so crude, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the real boss in Iran, didn't support his re-election for president. So Ayatollah Khamenei pointedly supported Rouhani, the current president, who has gone out of his way to be conciliatory to Israel, sent Jewish New Year's greetings to then President of Israel, Shimon Peres, said, no, we don't deny the Holocaust, that wasn't right to say that. That does not mean that Iran today is a wonderful regime. It is not. They are awful on women's rights, even worse on gay rights. I mean, there basically are no gay rights in Iran. They are terrible on religious freedoms. They persecute Baha'is. They're not great with Jews either. The United States has dealt with many regimes that are equally, if not more, awful. The Soviet Union wasn't a great supporter of human rights either, and had nuclear weapons, and we knew it. And we managed to coexist with them until the whole thing was chilled out. And I don't know what's going to happen in Iran in the next 10 years. There is a youthful generation that really does not buy the story of the Ayatollahs. They want drugs, sex, and rock and roll just like all young people around the world do. And maybe the old Ayatollahs won't stay around forever. The only way that the United States can have any influence over what direction Iran might eventually go in, because things aren't going to stay the same, we know that, is if it has some kind of relationship with them. And this is the key question, the nuclear question. We don't know, Prime Minister Netanyahu notwithstanding, what the terms of a potential deal on nuclear weapons with Iran might be. When the deal is reached, if there will be one, we'll look at the text, and then we'll be able to judge, is this a reasonable one or not? I'm sure that there will be lots of political debate about that, but there's no useful purpose to trying to scotch the deal before it even emerges.
You talked about political grandstanding. One line stood out to me in particular from the Prime Minister. The days of Israel being passive in the face of genocidal enemies are over. That's very strong language aimed at Iran, but you think that this is exactly playing into domestic politics?
Yes. I mean, again, if you wanted to go through the line-by-line analysis of text of different things that have been said in Iran about Israel, no doubt, the rhetoric has on occasion been genocidal and worse. I don't think politics is about taking what political figures say word for word and believing them. We don't do that in the United States with our political leaders, do we? Does anybody here actually believe 100% of what every political figure that they've ever heard speak says? That's not realistic. So there's a certain amount of playing to a domestic audience that Iranian politicians do. There's a certain amount of religious prejudice involved in what they say. They have internal political considerations just like any other country does. Israelis have been on record, especially during the recent conflict in Gaza, saying equally genocidal things about Palestinians. So if we were to say, oh, well, Netanyahu can't come before Congress because a member of his coalition wrote on her Facebook page that the mothers of all Palestinian terrorists should be killed because otherwise they will raise further little snakes, and their houses should be destroyed too, and their blood be upon them, which is a Hebrew phrase for kill them all. You know, what's the difference? The difference is we don't really care too much about Palestinian lives, and Israelis certainly on the whole don't. And we do now care more about Jewish lives, which is a good thing. I mean, the Holocaust happened. No one should deny that. The West did sit on its hands while it was happening and knew it. That was bad, no doubt. But Israel hasn't really learned the lesson that just because somebody did it to you doesn't authorize you to do it to them.
We'll talk more about Palestine, obviously, and especially Gaza in a few minutes. But I did want to say about this, you know, not taking political rhetoric at face value. The Israelis do have a history of using their force and going in. So when the Prime Minister says something's an existential threat and we need to defend ourselves, we're not going to be passive, shouldn't we take that seriously, that they're going to act whether we consent to it or not?
I tend to think not. Rhetoric was at an equally hysterical level in the summer of 2012. Cy Hirsch wrote in the New Yorker around that time that he had the inside information Israel was going to attack Iran. President Bush said, no, you're not going to do that. And they didn't. The other people who said, no, we're not going to do that, are the Israeli General Staff, who basically told Netanyahu, you're out of your mind. Not only can we not technically do this, because it's a long plane flight from Israel to Iran, and they'd have to get permission to fly over countries like Jordan and Iraq, which they would not get, and they also wouldn't get permission now to fly over Turkey to go around. So there's a pretty big problem technically for Israel to do anything, and the Israeli high command and the military intelligence folks and the civilian intelligence folks are all against it. So I don't say it's impossible. I mean, there's no way to predict the future, but I think it's not very likely.
How much did this speech today help Netanyahu domestically and politically?
That's unclear. He had been falling fairly precipitously in the polls. There were reports in the Israeli press yesterday that Likud leaders were saying they might get as few as 13 out of 120 seats in the elections to the Knesset on March 17th.
Why? Where's this weakness come from?
The weakness comes from everybody in Israel knows that Netanyahu is a liar, that he is shifty, that he's engaged in all sorts of, if not corrupt, quasi-corrupt activities. And the only reason that he is likely, nonetheless, to be the next prime minister of Israel is because all the opposition figures in comparison are pygmies.
What's the political dynamic in Israel right now? Because this is a situation where you need coalitions to rule. So is this leaning right? Is this leaning center?
Oh, it's leaning far right. Israel today, under the prime ministership of Benjamin Netanyahu, is governed by the most right-wing coalition in its history. I mean, you have, as I mentioned, not just one. I was referring to Miri Regev, but there are, Ayelet Shaked, but there are several other people in the coalition and even in high ranks in the coalition who have openly favored expelling Palestinians from the West Bank, annexing all of the West Bank. There's no question that there is not a majority in the cabinet for any form of a Palestinian state whatsoever. It's likely that a coalition that Netanyahu would lead, should he become prime minister after March 17th, would be equally, if not further, right-leaning. The basic situation is that Israel is very fragmented politically. We have two big political parties. They have two medium-sized political parties and a lot of small to medium-sized parties. So the two largest blocs are the Likud on the right and the Zionist camp in the center. They were running roughly equal at 23 to 25 seats apiece a week or so ago. And then came this report that Netanyahu is collapsing in the polls and the Likud might get as few as 13. I think that's actually not, that's a little bit alarmist. The worst I think they could reasonably do is about 18. So even if they get, let's say, 18 and the Zionist camp, the center bloc, which is formed by the Labor Party and the Kadima Party, Tzipi Livni heads that. Yitzhak Herzog, no one's heard of him even, so that's why Israelis don't think he's qualified to be the next prime minister. Let's say they get 23, 24. So okay, they have to look for coalition partners. Netanyahu has obvious and natural coalition partners. There is the Jewish Home Party to his right. There are the ultra-Orthodox religious parties, both those of the Eastern Jews, the Mizrahim, and those of the European Jews. They are easy partners because all they want is budgets for their private school systems and networks of social services. They lean right anyway on this question and certainly on social issues. It's not too hard to accommodate them. There are some small center parties like There Is a Future party, which is a big party, big-ish party now with 17 seats, but they might come in with 7 to 10 seats. They're in the coalition now. They would be likely to go with Netanyahu. So if you add up the numbers, even if the center bloc ends up with several more seats than Netanyahu, their allies to the left are not easy coalition partners. So all the Arab parties in Israel have been compelled by raising the minimum number of votes necessary to get into the Knesset altogether to unite. So 3 Arab parties, an Islamist party, a communist party, and a nationalist party that don't really agree with each other are all together. And surprisingly, the polls show them at coming into 12 to 15. But no Zionist party is going to bring them into the coalition. So even though they will never vote for anything a Netanyahu-led government proposes, neither will Yitzhak Herzog, who's the leader of the Zionist camp bloc, make them a part of his government. The best that he could do, and with preserving any political legitimacy among most Israeli Jews, is hope that they'll vote for him from outside the coalition, which they may or may not. The left Zionist party, Meretz, might get 5 seats, so Meretz is a natural partner for the center bloc. So that might give them 30-ish. That's half of what you need. It's not easy to see how they're going to get to 61, which is what you need to form a government.
Right. I mean, Iran notwithstanding, I guess most of the stories we hear about Israel are either about Gaza, be it rockets from Hamas, or Israel then punishing Gaza for the rockets from Hamas, or other security issues, maybe surrounding settlements and the clashes therefrom. I mean, how do these things play in to Israeli politics? Are these as hot button as we think they are from the outside?
Yes and no. Most Israelis have given up on the idea that there can be a peace agreement, a comprehensive peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. They have drunk the Kool-Aid that has been mixed since the failure of the July 2000 Camp David summit. We have no partner. Arafat never wanted peace in the first place. He ignited the Second Intifada. He's a terrorist. And even though Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat's successor as president of the Palestinian Authority, has bent over backward to do everything the Israelis and Palestinians have asked, the Likud and the parties to the right still say he's a terrorist, he's an insider, yada, yada, yada. So most Israelis have bought this story and don't even think about what party might lead us to a successful negotiation with Palestinians, because they don't think that can happen. So how does it work? Well, if you live in Tel Aviv, and in the greater Tel Aviv area, which is called the Tel Aviv bubble, you have a normal life, like San Francisco. Same weather, it's totally cool. They have nice cafes and pubs and good restaurants and a beach and culture, art museums and concerts, and it's very, very nice. And nearly half of the Jewish population of Israel lives in that zone. If you live in Jerusalem, so it's mostly Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, and you live in your little ghetto, and there's a whole different scene going on there, and you don't really care much about broader issues beyond those that affect your community. So what Israelis are focused on in this election, to the extent that there is any issue at all, and in much of the reporting there is no actual issue. Netanyahu spent too much money on a plumber for his private house, and the plumber turns out to be a crony from his party, and he worked on Saturday, which is A, illegal, and B, he paid him too much money. you know, what is that? I mean, that we're going to decide the fate of a country on the basis of something like that. It's like Monica Lewinsky, except even less substantial. So the other thing that Israelis worry about is the price of cottage cheese, because the cost of living has skyrocketed in Israel, especially cost of buying and renting property. So there is now, as we speak, an effort to reignite the social protests that erupted in Israel in the summer of 2011, during which for about a month and a half or so, many young people, many thousands of young people occupied one of the main thoroughfares in downtown Tel Aviv. And their slogan is, I have a job and I can't afford to buy an apartment.
Let me clarify. The issue of the price of cottage cheese is more an issue than the Palestinians?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because
how is it possible that Israel would be containing more than 1 million people in Gaza and cottage cheese trumps that in elections?
You don't see those 1 million people in Gaza if you live in Tel Aviv.
Out of sight,
they're just
out of
like
mind,
over there. They're behind a wall, literally behind a wall. Gaza is an open-air prison. And okay, we bomb them every few years, and the military calls that mowing the lawn. And, you know, a couple of our boys might have to die in the course of doing that. That's the price we pay for living in a Jewish state. We're surrounded by enemies. The whole world hates us. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always going to be. And we can't afford to buy houses, and our children can't live middle-class lives the way we have been able to. And cottage cheese costs too much, and that's the problem.
There's been the comparison to apartheid. Do you agree with that?
Not exactly. There are some important similarities between Israel and South Africa. The most important one is that both are settler colonial states. Now, that's not a curse word. The United States is also a settler colonial state, as is New Zealand and Australia and others as well. So that creates a certain dynamic between European settlers who come to a place and claim that it's theirs and treat the indigenous people badly. And the big difference between Israel and other settler colonial states is the historic attachment of Jews to the land. But the last time that there was any Jewish political presence in Palestine was before Jesus Christ was born. So it's been a while. So okay, Jews do remember, and that's important. I mean, I don't minimize that or poo-poo it. But in most places around the world, saying that you lived here 2,000 years ago doesn't give you the right to appropriate the territory from the people who have been living there for the last several hundreds of years. So in that sense, and in the sense of the 40-some discriminatory laws against Palestinian citizens of Israel. So we're not even talking about occupation at this point. 20% of all the citizens of Israel are Palestinian Arabs. They are discriminated against in many, many ways. Their budgets that the government allocates to their villages for education are less per capita than for Jewish settlements. The same is true for health, welfare. No Palestinian settlement has a swimming pool, a municipal swimming pool. Most significant Jewish settlements do. There's a whole range of things, starting from the idea that it's a Jewish state. Well, if you are a Palestinian Arab and you're a citizen, and it's a Jewish state, where do you find yourself in that? So there are often these scandals when, say, there is a Palestinian Arab who's a member of the Israeli Supreme Court. And when the court session begins, the justices stand, and he doesn't sing the national anthem. Why? Because the national anthem begins for as long as in every Jewish heart there is a hope. Well, okay, he's not Jewish. What, he's going to sing about his Jewish heart? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So, and then people get hysterical. Oh, he didn't sing the national anthem. Well, anybody ever think that, well, if 20% of people aren't Jews, maybe we should have a national anthem that they could relate to? No, that's not even a question for a discussion in polite Jewish society. So there is a discriminatory structure in Israel before we even get to the question of the obviously discriminatory structure of any kind of military occupation, which is what's going on in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But in apartheid South Africa, one of the main points of apartheid was to preserve cheap African labor and to make sure that white people got paid more. This is not what goes on with the occupation. Israel does not want to employ Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at all. So some South Africans have said this is actually worse than apartheid. At least under apartheid, we were allowed to work and support our families. Palestinians under occupation can't even do that. So I don't think it's worth making the judgment, this is better, this is worse. I mean, I think that's a kind of a silly calculus. There are important differences, there are important similarities.
Noam Chomsky made that exact point about apartheid, saying that in some ways the situation in Gaza is worse. And he was writing in response to the BDS movement, the boycott, divestiture, and sanctions movement, even though there are no sanctions against Israel for what's going on in Gaza. Can you talk about that whole movement as a response to what's happened in Gaza?
Well, first, there are actually sanctions. We don't hear about it in the United States because American politics on this question is very much distorted from what goes on in the rest of the world.
Against Israel?
Yes. The European Union, for example, compels Israel to label agricultural and all other products, but especially agricultural products, on whether they have been produced in Israel proper, that is inside the boundaries of the Green Line, which was the internationally recognized frontier between Israel and the West Bank and Israel and the Gaza Strip, or whether they're produced in the West Bank. There are no more Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, so it's only the West Bank where we're talking about, in which there are 600,000 Israeli settlers. And they won't accept for sale in the European Union products that are manufactured in the West Bank.
Why specifically?
Because the West Bank is under an illegal occupation, which has been condemned many, many times by the United Nations and so forth. So Europe has been steadily, not all of Europe. Germany is a big exception, and it's pretty obvious why that's the case. But Europe has been moving steadily to ratchet up the level of sanctions against Israel for continuing the occupation, for violating international law in how it conducts the occupation. And that's likely to continue in places like Britain and Ireland. Israel is considered one of the least favorable countries in opinion polls, in public opinion polls in the world. Do they deserve that? Or is their human rights record worse, for example, than China? Well, actually, I don't think so, but it's pretty bad. So there are real sanctions, and they are likely to increase. The broader movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is something that was called for by over 150 Palestinian civil society organizations in 2005. And their thinking was the negotiations that the United States has been mediating between Israel and Palestinians since 1990 have gone exactly nowhere. And they're not going to go anywhere, and I would totally agree with this. Because just think about it, it's basic common sense. The ally of one side in a dispute can't really be the mediator in the dispute. In no other situation would that be considered a reasonable way to settle a dispute, that my friend is going to mediate between me and you. So Palestinian civil society groups said, you know, our leadership is corrupt. Our leadership has no backbone. We don't trust the United States. All we can do is call on the world to stand in solidarity with us, help us, and we will try to organize ourselves outside the framework of our corrupt political leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, equally corrupt and awful in many respects. And so then it took some years before the movement reached the United States, basically only after the 2008, 2009 Israeli attack on Gaza, which was the first of 3 that we've had since then. When Americans began to, especially on college campuses, think, oh, well, this is something we can do, because obviously the Obama administration has sat on its hands through all 3 of these attacks and done absolutely nothing, and keeps on asserting there's no daylight between us and Israel. Well, now after this Netanyahu trick, Obama might not exactly express himself in those terms, but functionally, the United States has been the blocking back for Israel and vetoed any proposed sanctions or even verbal critique in the UN Security Council and so on. So, and of course, the United States has continued to supply Israel with $3 billion plus of military aid and a lot more goodies besides that.
Well, that's another point. If you're going to talk about sanctions, shouldn't you sanction everybody who's involved in the occupation? And some people argue that supplying arms to Israel makes the United States complicit in that.
I believe that's true. I believe that's true.
So is the BDS movement then toothless? Are Europe's sanctions pointless if they're not going to truly damage their relations with the United States, I guess?
So I think the way this conflict is developing is on several different tracks. On the one hand, Israel's repeated military atrocities and its entrenchment of the occupation, expansion of settlements, unwillingness to engage in meaningful negotiations is increasingly isolating it in the world. Israel is making itself into a pariah state. For reasons of domestic politics, basically the electoral clout of the Israel lobby, and because Israel, with all of the problems that it has in terms of its relationship with the United States, still is the most important military force between Morocco and Pakistan. It's an important security and intelligence partner for the United States. So there's that value to Israel too, from the Washington perspective. So the United States isn't going to be able to resolve this conflict. I mean, anyone who's followed President Obama since before he came into office, because he knows better than what he's done. He's just decided there's a political football and I don't want to touch it because I have other things that are better to do. So the United States is making itself irrelevant in the conflict. Europe sees that. Europe does not want to have a fight with the United States about that. But Russia and China and other countries, Brazil, India, may very well be willing to have a fight with the United States about that. And as we go forward, American power in the world is declining. That's pretty obvious. Does that mean we're headed for the trash bin? No, I don't think so. America is still a very strong and powerful country and will be for many decades going forward and maybe forever and ever. I don't know. How could we possibly know that? But the United States is not going to be the single global superpower going forward. So on the one hand, Israel is becoming increasingly isolated in the world. On the other hand, the United States is obviously impotent when it comes to resolving this conflict. That opens the field for Europe and others to do something. In this situation, a global civil society movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions can have, in certain circumstances, a political impact. So I haven't seen the final list, but it was reported on the news this morning before Netanyahu's speech that 50 Democrats boycotted the speech and didn't show up. So it wouldn't be altogether impossible, because those 50 Democrats are going to be attacked like nothing you ever saw before by the Israel lobby. It wouldn't be altogether impossible to see a real debate over American policy vis-a-vis the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, especially among some of those 50 Democrats who know they're not going to get the Zionist lobby money for their election campaign, so they might as well come out and say what they think. Because a lot of people in Congress are fed up with Israel. If you get them off the record in private, they'll say that. So things are in a process of change. How exactly those changes are going to work out, I'm not sure. Will change happen? Yes, because the only thing that we actually learn from history is that nothing stays the same.
I'm going to open it up for questions here in just a minute, but you said the other day you think the two-state solution is done, right? That's not an option anymore?
I was a little bit more careful than that.
Okay.
I said, I think the two-state solution in the form that the international community has come to consensus on, a Palestinian state more or less based on the 1967 borders, mutual territorial swaps agreed on, Jerusalem as the West Jerusalem capital of Israel, East Jerusalem capital of Palestine. That's very, very, very unlikely to happen. It's, there's some minuscule percentage of a possibility. I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I wouldn't put 2 cents on that. Does that mean that the other widely known option, one state, one person, one vote, is going to happen? No, I don't think so. Neither side wants that. There are 2 national communities between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Both insist on the preservation of their national culture and identities, and they have the right to insist on that, in my opinion. So some creative political solution that's neither 2 states as we have known it or 1 state as the currently known option is likely going to be necessary. How soon will that come about? I have no idea.
I'm going to press you a tiny bit because you hedged, and I think that as far as I can see it, we're at a chicken and an egg stage. That Israel won't give up pretty much any security details to the Palestinians, any serious ones, because they feel constantly threatened by Hamas. So you're in a place where you have Gaza, which barely has electricity, barely has water, has a corrupt government, as you pointed out. It's not functioning at all as a society.
No,
so
it's
to
not.
say there's still a possibility that it could bloom into a state or state-like function, I mean, is that really a possibility?
I wasn't minimal enough about the possibility. I mean, I just don't want to say 0 because how would I know? It's pretty unlikely that this is going to happen. I want to push back on you on one term too, which is security. I hate to do this. This is ugly and fundamentally immoral. But if you add up the numbers in any given period of the conflict, the number of Israelis killed by Palestinians is usually running about 1 to 20 versus how many Palestinians have been killed by Israelis. And that is the case going all the way back to right after the 1948 war. Even in the 1948 war, where the number of casualties was not quite as skewed, a good case could be made that far more Palestinians died than Israelis. I want to go back and say this is ugly to say that. Every human life is infinitely valuable. If 2 people here were killed and 20 people there were killed, that's an equal tragedy. But don't the Palestinians have some right to their security? Israel has been threatening the security of the Palestinians every single day since it was created as a state. It expelled over 700,000 of them from their country and didn't let them back, in the face of United Nations and even United States insistence at first that they needed to do that. Those people, don't they have any right to security and security of their homes and their property, which Israel has confiscated since then and given to Jewish immigrants for the most part? So if we think of it a little bit more expansively, yes, Hamas from time to time rains rockets on Israel. Very few Israelis are actually killed by those rockets. a far, far, far larger number of Israelis are killed in traffic accidents than are killed by any kind of Palestinian armed attacks in any given year. So a certain sense of proportion, I think, is required here.
You don't think Hamas and Hezbollah are just extensions of Iran and thus part of a greater security issue for the existence of Israel?
Hamas is certainly not an extension of Iran. In fact, they broke completely with the Syrian regime, which is an ally of Iran, when the Assad regime started attacking Sunni Muslims. Hamas are Sunnis. They don't like it that the Syrians are attacking Sunnis, who are the majority of the population in Syria. So there's no substantial connection now. There was sometimes in the past. They did receive arms and so forth and so on. And there may be still some minor back channel, but according to Israeli military intelligence, Hamas is now manufacturing the majority of the weapons it uses on its own. So Hamas, Iran, that's not part of an alignment. Hezbollah, Iran, yes. There is a strategic alliance between Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. They are way too occupied for now with dealing with Syria and Lebanon to threaten Israel in any significant way, nor did they historically actually threaten Israel existentially. They were a pain in the butt, there's no doubt about that. But let's remember how Hezbollah came into existence. Hezbollah came into existence to defend the Shia of Lebanon after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 with no provocation whatsoever. So are they nice guys? No, they have kidnapped and assassinated Americans. They've done all manner of horrible things. They're not my friends. I don't like them. But you know, again, let's have some sense of proportion about who is doing what to whom and why.
We've touched on lots of things. Hopefully we've given you something to think about, and maybe you have questions. If you do, we have a microphone right here. Don't be shy. You can come up and ask whatever you want. Hopefully we've primed the pump, and you can come up. It's your chance now.
I have a question, Doctor.
Whatever.
I hear a lot about, you know, politics and, you know, geopolitical strategy, but for some reason, my heart just keeps telling me that I want to hear more about the heart. I want to hear more about people, about how we all hurt. And what is your vision? What is the vision of a better society?
So I'm glad you said that, because I actually come from that place. I decided to be a professor because I lived in Israel and I thought I was going to live there for the rest of my life. And I began to see that this is not the Israel that I was told about in Hebrew school. And I decided, okay, what I need to do now is to learn how to live with Arabs. So first thing is you learn Arabic. Second thing is you don't live with Arabs in territory that Israel governs, because they're not themselves there. So I went to Egypt and I lived in Egypt for a while. So the talks that I gave today at Kent State and yesterday at Case Western Reserve were about a movement of joint resistance to the occupation among Palestinians and Israelis and internationals, fighting together on the basis of equality under Palestinian leadership, non-violently, not an armed struggle by any means. And I studied this movement and followed it, observing demonstrations and talking with participants, Palestinians and Israelis, over a few years. And there is no problem. If Israelis accept that Palestinians have national rights in the country and are willing to deal with them on the basis of equality, people get along just fine. I mean, I went to Palestinian villages with Israelis who are coming to demonstrate, typically after Friday prayers. They welcome us, they feed us, they spill out their hearts to us. I mean, they don't know me from Adam, but they're very trusting and open, and ask me questions, and I speak to them in Arabic, so it's relatively easy to do. I've never felt unsafe. I've never felt under any kind of a threat, and nobody that I've ever spoken to has thought that I'm some kind of a spy and whatever. It's pretty simple. If you treat people like you would like to be treated, then it works well.
Yes, sir.
Hello. I have a couple things to say, and then I have 3 questions that are interrelated. I was listening to Fox News
We've got a lot of questions, so if you could just be quick.
Basically, and they said that there was an Israeli censor due to the election, and it was live broadcast back in Israel.
It was
the speech.
5-minute delay.
Okay, yeah. He was basically also at a censor.
There is Israeli military censorship on the media. That's true.
I also, last month at church, I saw the movie 5 Cameras. And basically the question I want to ask is the main difference between Obama and Netanyahu. And my opinion, the biggest difference is Mr. Netanyahu is betting the lives of his children on the settlement or peace. Mr. Obama is not betting the lives of his children on the peace settlement in Israel, because realistically, his children will never go there. And also, what rights do the Israelis have to protect their citizens or people based on what Putin has done in Russia or Ukraine? And why should Israel trust Obama based on what happened in Syria and what happened in Ukraine?
So I'm not sure what
they all tie together,
Ukraine has to do with this, actually. But the fundamental issue is actually something else. Israeli policy, and not just under Netanyahu, but all the way back to 1967 and even before that, but then it gets much more complicated. Israeli policy has been to gobble up as much of the West Bank as it can. And of course, the Palestinians who live there don't agree to that. And they fight back, some of them violently, some of them less violently, but that's very normal. That's what happens in the world when countries invade other countries and try to annex it. So the desire of all the Israeli governments since 1967 to annex more or less of the West Bank, they have differed on how much, is what has driven the conflict since then. Is that the only issue in the conflict? No, it is not, but we're restricting ourselves to post-67 for the moment. That is what produces the insecurity for Israelis. Now, the insecurity is real. If you try to keep your foot on somebody else's neck, they're going to struggle to get up. And if they do get up, they might stab you in the back. That's normal. You don't have to be especially evil for that to happen. That's just the way it is. On the other hand, there was a Palestinian, Aziz Shahada, who less than a year after Israel invaded the West Bank, wrote a book, There's No Solution Without an Independent Palestinian State. Israeli officials went and spoke to him, checked this idea out, and decided, nah, we don't want to do that. Why don't we want to do that? Because we want to annex too much of the territory for somebody like that to be happy. So Israel can actually be more secure, or historically could have been more secure. I'm not sure that this option is exactly open anymore. Could have been more secure if it had been prepared for territorial settlement on the basis of the 1967 lines. Since it wasn't, Israelis are now insecure, and they're going to be insecure going forward until there's peace. So saying, as the Netanyahu government does, oh, they hate us, they kill us, they're terrorists, Obama doesn't protect us. First of all, that's nonsense. Military assistance to Israel has increased under the Obama administration. Security assistance has increased. Israel does not need the United States and does not want the United States to militarily defend Israel. So there's no problem with what Obama has done to Israel. The problem is what Israelis have done to themselves, by and large.
I have two questions, hopefully both of them quick. Do you think that Israel uses the idea of Jews as victims to deflect criticism of their victimization of Palestine? And second, maybe a little bit farther afield, I've been led to believe that ISIS occupies some or uses some territory that abuts the Golan Heights. Would you say that, given that Israel seems to find ISIS less of a threat than many U.S. policymakers make it out to be?
Ooh, the second question is really complicated, so let's talk about the first one first. Jews were victims. We should not deny or forget that. There was a mass murder of some 6 million European Jews, half the Jewish population of Europe. That's a huge thing. Now, it's not the only genocide in history, but it's a genocide of a peculiar sort because it was ideologically motivated, and Hitler in Mein Kampf said this is what he wanted to do, and everybody thought that was crazy, and it turned out, no, he was really serious about it. And the West did not do anything to stop it, and that was horrible. And we did not learn the lesson because we sat on our hands again while there was a genocide in Rwanda. So we in the United States and more broadly in the West have a certain historical responsibility. But Jews have been victims, and they are right to feel a certain anxiety about that. We know that when there is alcoholism in a family or when there is abuse in a family, it's very likely that the children of that family are going to grow up and be alcoholics or abusers. That's how trauma is transferred from generation to generation. And especially in Israel, but even more broadly in the United States, most Jews are suffering from a post-traumatic situation in which, in Israel, it's the educational curriculum in elementary and high school that drums this into people that they have been victimized, that we have to watch out, we have to defend ourselves, and so forth. I mean, so there's a certain amount of that which is reasonable, and there's a certain amount of that which is excessive, and it's very hard to find the exact correct balance. And yes, Israel and its uncritical supporters do typically use the Holocaust as either justification or diversion from what Israel has done to Palestinians. No one was more explicit about this than former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was the first Likud Prime Minister of Israel, was elected in 1977, and he was Prime Minister at the time of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which, as I said, was totally unprovoked. And it aroused a storm of protest in the world, and he got up in the Knesset and said, no one has the right to teach morals to us after the Holocaust. So, okay, we can do whatever we want because that happened to us. And he was very explicit about it, and he spoke about it constantly. It was a constant theme of his political rhetoric. Others are less egregious in that respect, but it's quite often a theme in justification for what Israel does, and Benjamin Netanyahu did it again today. The state of Israel is not going to put up with genocide. Well, not only is genocide actually not happening, Iran doesn't actually have a nuclear weapon. No intelligence service in the world believes that Iran has a nuclear weapon or has the intention of manufacturing a nuclear weapon right now. So there's a big difference between an actual attack, which should and would be resisted by every civilized country in the world, and the imagination that something could happen. Something could happen, but how likely is it that that could happen? So yes, there is exaggeration of the extent to which an imminent genocide threatens either Israel or, for that matter, Jews in Europe. I mean, yes, there's been an increase in anti-Semitism in Europe. Netanyahu goes to France and says, okay, you all French Jews come to Israel. And not French Prime Minister walked out of that speech, and the president of the synagogue in which he spoke got up and said, we are French. Our home is France. And many American Jews have said the same to Netanyahu's claim to represent the Jewish people everywhere. I didn't vote for him. Most Jews voted for Obama. Why does Netanyahu get to say, come to the United States and insult President Obama and say he represents me? He doesn't. So it's kind of annoying. ISIS.
We've got more questions. So I know this is complicated, but if
okay,
you
we'll try to be
quickly
on this. So there has been some ISIS activity in the region of the Golan Heights, but that's not their main base. Their main base is much further north and east in the Raqqa region of Syria and then on over to Iraq. Israel is happy that ISIS poses a threat to the Assad regime because the Assad regime historically is a much more formidable enemy to Israel. This is a very bad gamble. Assad regime is ugly, ISIS is ugly, but Israel doesn't have the capacity to sort that out, and neither does the United States. Bombing Syria when it was discovered to have had chemical weapons wouldn't have fixed anything. Bombing ISIS, as the United States is doing now, isn't going to fix anything. That's not the way this is going to be sorted out.
Thank you. My question is more of a request for some clarification. You used the word settlement twice when you were talking about the 20%, it's actually 20% plus Arab population of Israel within the internationally recognized borders. You used the word Palestinian settlement, and
sorry, I was translating from Hebrew.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to, because it is an important point. It's the only place in the world where a native population is considered residents as far as Jerusalem is concerned. And for a lay audience that may not understand that, it's a complication.
So the word for settlement in Hebrew is hityashvut, and that's the word that was used by the Zionist movement from the late 19th century when European Jews began settling in Palestine, and it's still used today. What happened after 1967 was that term was simply transferred to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to apply to new Jewish settlements that were established in occupied territory that had formerly been governed by Jordan in the case of the West Bank, governed by Egypt in the case of the Gaza Strip. So it's that very continuity of the term that the right wing in Israel uses to legitimate it. They say to the Labor Party people and others who oppose settling Jews in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, oh, we're just doing what you did when you led the Zionist movement throughout the 20th century. So what's the difference between settling in Tel Aviv and settling in the West Bank? And at a certain level, there actually is no difference because the entire country up until 1917 was 93% Arab. So settlement, when I talked about Arab villages of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, that just means an inhabited place. It's obviously not a settlement by a settler colonial population because they have been there for hundreds of years. Next.
Well, there's so many questions I could ask you, but I'm going to narrow it down to just one. But before I ask the question, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming tonight and letting me know. I'm sure I'm not the only one here to know about how Palestinian Israeli citizens are treated, and that certainly sounds a lot like how minorities were treated here in this country, you know, up until what? The 1950s, 60s, when the civil rights movement happened and all that stuff. So that was new to me, and talking about how the Jews that live in Tel Aviv don't even think about what's going on the other side of the wall, and that they're totally disconnected from that. You know, that was kind of news to me too, although it doesn't surprise me. So anyways, my question that I'm going to ask you is, what do you think is the way for the Palestinians to move forward from this point? Because I kind of look at, you know, you have Israel, you have the United States, you have their allies telling the Palestinians, you know, reject kind of what Hamas wants to do in terms of violently rebelling against Israel in that matter and trying to end the occupation violently, do it peacefully, do it non-violently. Yet when, you know, the Palestinian Authority recently tried to get recognition as a state in the United Nations, you know, that was not passed, if I'm correct. Although I am happy about the fact that they have, I think the Palestinians have gotten recognition by the International Criminal Court in filing, you know, criminal charges against Israel specifically for what happened in Gaza this past summer. And so I really hope, I guess there's supposed to be a lot with that happening next month in April. So yeah, so what do you think is, how do the Palestinians move forward in trying to have legitimacy on the world stage with, you know, being recognized by the world as being a legitimate country or entity separate from Israel and having their grievances addressed?
Right, thank you.
So Palestine actually has the status of an observer state at the United Nations. They are not members of the United Nations because that has to be passed by the Security Council, and even if they could obtain a majority there, the United States would veto that. But observer state status is decided in the General Assembly, where an overwhelming majority of the countries voted for Palestine. So there's a small legal difference between this and that, but it's because Palestine is an observer state that it can go to the International Criminal Court, join other United Nations institutions, and so on. So all of that is happening. It isn't doing much for the Palestinian people because it's not a real state, and it's not likely to become one in the form that we have been imagining that it might, as I mentioned before. I study the Arab world. I write much more about Egypt than I do about Israel-Palestine, but I write about Israel and Palestine plenty also. And I have long established a rule for myself. I don't give Arabs political advice. It's not my thing to do. You know, in a private discussion with friends, if we bat things back and forth and they ask me, I'll express an opinion. Sometimes I've even expressly been invited, especially in Egypt, to tell people about Israel or to give my opinion about a certain thing, and I do it when I'm asked. But I don't stand up in public and say, you Palestinians, do it this way. I'm a little bit looser when it comes to Israel because as I said, my entire immediate family has lived in Israel since 1973. It's not my country, and I don't want it to be my country, and I don't think of it as a country that I'm going to run away to if there's ever any problem in the United States. If there's a problem in the United States, my plan is to stay and fight. But I'm a little bit looser with giving advice on what Israelis should do.
Next question, yep.
Thank you very much for being here. Just maybe a short thing and then a second question. Jewish people make aliyah to Israel and go back anywhere from the world. How about the Palestinian right under UN 194, the right of return, and there may be half of all the Palestinians are outside? That's short, but the other thing is, what is this doing to American democracy? 100 regular votes in the U.S. Senate for this thing you've described. And secondly, what about the militarization of the U.S. police forces? 9,000 U.S. police have been trained in Israel, and the police in Ferguson were trained by, the police chief had been to Israel. And what effect is that having on us as Americans, aside from what's happening over there? Two points.
American democracy is in trouble not largely because of anything that has to do with Israel and Palestine. American democracy is in trouble because we've allowed our civil liberties to be eroded after 9/11. This is a different country than it was before then. I mean, stuff that goes on in airports and all manner of other places, people would never have put up with that before, and we should stop that now. The other thing that erodes American democracy is the idea of $1, one vote. And that has nothing to do with the Middle East either. That has to do with the Supreme Court. And the other thing that erodes American democracy is that the banks own the country. Yeah. After the crash in 2008, the banks got bailed out and the people got nothing. If you had a mortgage and your house was underwater, tough luck for you most of the time. And if you were Chrysler, you got bailed out. And if you were a major bank, you got bailed out even bigger. And the profits of the financial sector in particular, but also the auto industry, are better than ever. And the real wages of people who depend on their salaries for income have been stagnant for 40 years. So that's what erodes American democracy, not primarily anything that has to do with Israel and Palestine. Do we have some issues related to that? Yes, we do, but they're relatively minor compared to the big ones. Palestinian right of return. So yes, it is true that the United Nations has passed and renewed almost every year for some decades, they haven't been doing it recently, a resolution saying that all Palestinians who want to live in peace with their Jewish neighbors should be allowed to return to their homes and to receive compensation for property lost or damaged and so forth and so on. That would amount to many tens of billions of dollars at this point. That right is also ensconced in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's a right that Israel decided to violate on June 16th, 1948, before the war was even over. It was a cabinet decision. It's on the record. It's not any real argument about that. When the two-state solution, as the international consensus thinks about it, was a realistic option, it almost happened in January of 2001 at the Taba negotiations. It was very, very close. When it was a realistic possibility, they did get down to talking about this. And Palestinian negotiators said, okay, we want Israel to recognize the right to return. And the Israelis say, no, of course we can't do that because millions of Palestinians will come back and there won't be a Jewish state, there won't be a Jewish majority. Okay, so this is a racist argument fundamentally anyway, but all right, we see that there's an issue there. So the Palestinians said, okay, recognize the right in principle, and we'll agree that 100,000 Palestinians can return, and that won't upset the demographic balance in Israel, and everything will be cool. And the Israeli negotiators said, no, 50,000. So, okay, we have a deal at 75,000. What's the problem then? It's not 75,000, it's not a lot of people after all, for a country of 7 million. Problem is that recognizing the right, even if it's not implemented at all, is a moral stain on Israel. Now, would that make Israel any different from the United States? I mean, we obliterated the Native American population here. The country was built on slavery. We have a lot of things that we should be very apologetic about. Does that mean every white person in this country is going back to Europe? No. Does that mean that the United States should be wiped off the face of the earth? No. But we have to deal with what we actually did. Well, Israeli Jews have to deal with what they actually did. And being honest and upfront about it is one of the most important things they might do in stepping towards a peaceful settlement of the conflict, because that's what the Palestinians want first and foremost, recognition of their dignity and their equal right as human beings.
So one or two more questions, then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you for that. I have a totally separate, very specific research-oriented question based on your talk last night, and I'm hoping I can talk to you after for a minute. But this one is about the stuff you've been talking about today. So I know you're not Israeli, you're not Palestinian, you are, I think, I'm not sure, part of the global Jewish diaspora. And my question is, especially given the rise in anti-Semitism in Europe that you've talked about, And the fact that many people connect some of that rise in anti-Semitism to anti-Israel sentiments and policies, is there a possibility, what is the role, what is the possibility of the global Jewish diaspora in terms of recognizing those connections and those threats, in terms of their ability to maybe put some pressure on the Israeli government about resolving this issue? And is that a possible route for hope, or is it too naive?
So I don't think someone like Prime Minister Netanyahu is interested in listening to me or any other American Jews who might have a different view of what Israel is doing than he is interested in listening to President Obama, who is, after all, responsible for giving his country $3 billion in military aid every year. I don't give them any military aid, so why should they listen to me? I think we have to be very clear. Israel is a state. Zionism is a political ideology. Judaism is a religion and a culture. Yes. Those three things are different. The person who is probably most responsible in the world for confusing those things is Benjamin Netanyahu. He gets on the plane in Israel to come to the United States, and he says, I'm going as a representative of all the Jewish people. Well, who asked you to represent me? I didn't ask for that, and in fact, I vehemently object. So one of the reasons that I do what I do, stick my neck out and make people angry at me for talking about this issue,
here we go,
is I want it written down for the record. I'm Jewish, and I do not agree with what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. And I think that this is the most important moral question before Jews today. How do we come out on this question? Being quiet about it, hiding from it, supporting Israel unquestionably, this is morally unacceptable and is going to lead to the moral degeneration of the Jewish people and the abandonment of the values that have made us a people for 2,000 years. And I am personally very attached to all of that. I mean, I went to Hebrew school for 12 years, and I was fluent in Hebrew by the age of 16, and I read Hebrew novels, and I'm Jewish. And I cherish those values. And what the state of Israel is doing is trampling on those values and encouraging Jews around the world to go along with that. If we speak up, is Netanyahu going to listen to us? I don't know, but I want the historical record to reflect that I didn't accept this.
Last question, please.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting. You described Netanyahu's appearance before Congress today as a political stunt. And I was just wondering how you felt about Elie Wiesel's appearance.
Okay, so this is going to maybe annoy some people. Elie Wiesel is the symbol of Jewish survival after the Holocaust, and received the Nobel Prize and is very widely respected, has written about the Holocaust and so forth, and has never criticized anything that Israel has done. In my mind, that makes him morally corrupt.
Well, on that note, hopefully, again, thank you first, Professor, for being here. Hopefully, we have given you all something to think about. Continue to talk about this issue and all these issues, because it's incredibly important that we keep the dialogue going on all of these issues, and hopefully we can move it forward eventually. On that note, I'm going to call this to a close.
Thank you, Professor Beinin. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you all for coming.
Knockmas has some pamphlets. If you would like them, please take one as you exit. Have a good evening.